Greetings to all our viewers tuning in to History War. There are victories in war that come without a single explosion, without fire and smoke, without tanks crashing through front lines or bombers tearing open the night sky. Some victories are born from silence, from moments when a single person in a small room makes a decision powerful enough to alter the fate of an entire continent. And the winter of 1944 was exactly that kind of winter. A winter when snow blanketed the forests of the Ardennes, yet beneath that stillness, a storm was brewing. It was a winter when the course of modern warfare nearly veered down a completely different path, if not for one simple answer: 48 hours. Picture a map of Western Europe in the final month of that year. After a string of victories from Normandy to Paris, the Allied command believed Nazi Germany was on its last legs. Intelligence reports, rear-line assessments, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Hitler no longer had the strength to launch any major offensive. The world believed the war was nearing its end. No one imagined that right at that moment, in the bitter cold and those seemingly harmless forests, one of Germany's largest counter-offensives of World War II was about to ignite. But before it all came crashing down, before German artillery thundered at 5 a.m. on December 16th, there was one man who quietly sensed that something wasn't right. A general known for being hot-headed, reckless even, yet gifted with a foresight others often lacked. This story isn't just about George S. Patton. It's about the moment he stood up in a meeting room in Verdun when Eisenhower asked, "How soon can you counterattack?" And Patton, without hesitation, without calculation, without pause, replied, 48 hours. It was an answer that stunned every officer in the room, because everyone knew that turning an entire army in the dead of winter, in chaos, under pressure from a collapsing front, was close to impossible. What made this moment a historic turning point wasn't recklessness, it wasn't luck, it wasn't a flash of inspiration. It came from something few ever saw: weeks of quiet, deliberate preparation. Patton had already ordered 3 different operational plans in 3 different directions for a scenario almost no one believed could happen. He had prepared for the unthinkable. And the natural question any viewer might ask is, how did Patton know? How did he see what intelligence other generals, even Eisenhower himself, didn't see? And more importantly, what enabled one of the most mobile armies of World War II to pivot nearly 90 degrees, traverse hundreds of kilometers through deep snow, and arrive in Bastogne in the nick of time? To answer those questions, we need to rewind a few weeks before that fateful moment. Back to the closing months of 1944, when faulty reports, overly optimistic assessments, and exhaustion after the Normandy campaign lulled the entire Allied command into a dangerous illusion of easy victory. An illusion that seemed harmless, but in truth became fertile ground for one of Hitler's boldest offensives. And that is where the real story begins. Because to understand why Patton said 48 hours, we must first understand why all of Europe fell under the illusion that the war was almost over. By the end of 1944, as the roads from Paris stretched directly toward the German border, their paths worn smooth by the relentless march of Allied troops, a sense of relief began to spread through the command posts. The entire Western Front seemed wrapped in a sweet illusion. Victory was now just a matter of time. Intelligence reports, updates from the rear, and scout briefings all echoed the same message. Germany was exhausted. Germany was running out of fuel. Germany had no reserves left. Germany was incapable of launching any major operations. Hitler, as the analysts described him, was nothing more than a cornered animal, dangerous but powerless. The Ardennes, a cold, forested region stretching between Belgium and Luxembourg, was therefore considered completely secure. Allied generals were convinced that no attacker in their right mind would attempt to push tanks through the narrow, winding, muddy roads buried in thick snow. It was seen as the ideal place to station new, inexperienced units who needed time to recover after previous campaigns. Every report confirmed the same: no unusual activity. And so a sense of complacency quietly seeped into every level of Allied thinking. What they didn't know was that everything they believed to be impossible was exactly what Hitler was counting on for his boldest strike since the fall of Normandy. While the Allies believed Germany was collapsing, in Berlin, the last remnants of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions were being quietly assembled, secretly trained, and prepared for one final gamble. A counteroffensive designed not just to push the Allies back, but to split the entire front in half and force them to negotiate. A small victory meant nothing at this point. Hitler wanted shock and awe, but on the front lines, no one saw it coming. At year-end strategy meetings, commanders debated plans to push into German territory with an air of optimism. They talked about the pace of their advance, their next objectives, the possibility of the war ending early the following year. Young soldiers stationed in the Ardennes wrote home about an easy assignment, a peaceful area, a quiet trench. They had no idea that just a few kilometers beyond those silent trees, panzer divisions were lying in wait. Heavy artillery was primed, and an attack involving hundreds of thousands of troops was being kept under absolute secrecy. This illusion was further fed by the weather. Heavy snowstorms grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft. They couldn't spot German supply convoys moving under the cover of darkness. They couldn't see the artillery being moved into place. They couldn't realize that the Ardennes, dismissed as a natural wall, was being transformed into the stage for a massive military operation. And so confidence turned into complacency. Complacency became blindness. Many later analyses suggest that if Hitler had chosen any other location, his attack would have been spotted early. But Ardennes, precisely because it was considered safe, became the deadly blind spot of the entire Allied front. They weren't prepared. They weren't on alert. They didn't ask questions. And that's when history began to turn its gears. Meanwhile, Patton, one of the few who sensed something was wrong, continued to keep his suspicions to himself. But most of the Allied command did not share his concern. They believed this winter would be quiet. They believed Germany had no strength left to fight. They believed the war was coming to a close. But war doesn't care about human belief. And in the shadows of that forest, a massive force was ready to shatter the illusion of peace in a single moment. That moment came on the early morning of December 16, 1944, before the sun had risen above the dew-soaked treetops, as American soldiers were beginning what they thought would be another uneventful day. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. The sky shook with the most intense artillery barrage since Normandy. The ground erupted, snow blasted into the air. Over 1,000 German guns opened fire at once, launching an assault no one believed Germany was still capable of mounting. And from that moment on, the illusion was shattered. The war changed its face, and the real story began. Dawn had yet to break. On the front lines of the Ardennes, American soldiers lay curled beneath damp, cold blankets, trying to cling to whatever warmth they could in the brutal winter. Wind howled through the trees, snow blanketed the roofs of dugouts, and everything was so still you could hear your own breathing. It was a morning like 100 others, in a place everyone believed to be peaceful. Then, at exactly 5:30 a.m., the eastern sky suddenly lit up, as if 100 bolts of lightning had exploded all at once. No one had time to understand what was happening. A second later, the ground shook violently. Another second, and the silence shattered under a deafening roar of artillery. German guns unleashing hell from deep within the forest. A storm of steel rained down on American positions, onto trenches, narrow roads, communication hubs, and sentry posts. It was the largest artillery barrage the Allies had faced since Normandy. Over 1,000 German guns fired simultaneously. The darkness was broken only by the flashes of fire dancing along the horizon. The earth trembled with each blast. Snow erupted into towering white plumes. Communications lines were obliterated within minutes. The relay stations that U.S. forces depended on to report enemy movement were wiped out almost instantly. Young soldiers sprang up in panic. They didn't know where to fire, didn't know where the enemy was, didn't even know what battle this was. Many believed it was just an isolated shelling, but only minutes later, the true shadow of the attack emerged. From the forest, following the barrage, German Panther and Tiger tanks began pouring out like steel phantoms. They surged down the narrow roads the Americans had long believed were impossible for tanks. They smashed through barriers, swept aside scattered outposts, and crushed inexperienced defensive units. Newly rebuilt and reinforced Volksgrenadier divisions advanced in dense formations, using fog and snow to mask their movement. Allied air power was paralyzed by the weather. The skies were thick with clouds, bitter winds and falling snow made any flight operation near impossible. Reconnaissance planes, the eyes of Allied command, were blinded. All information now depended on the ground. But the ground was collapsing beneath their feet. Supply lines were cut. Rear echelon units had no idea the front was disintegrating. Small towns like Clairvaux and St. Vith were plunged into chaos. And as desperate, fragmented calls for help began to trickle in from the front, Allied commanders still refused to believe it was a full-scale offensive. They thought, no way. Germany doesn't have the strength. But the map didn't lie. Just hours after the first artillery thundered, an odd bulge began to take shape on the battlefield maps. A swelling of enemy territory deep into American lines, spreading like a tear through a taut sheet. Officers would later call it the Bulge, the bulging front line that symbolized Hitler's dagger thrust into the heart of Western Europe. One soldier later wrote in his memoir, "We weren't fighting an army. We were fighting a nightmare. Everything we believed in collapsed in one morning." This wasn't just an opening battle. It was a chain reaction collapse. Regiments lost contact, lost commanders, lost orientation in the blinding snow. German tanks advanced so quickly, many U.S. units had no time to retreat. In some places, American soldiers fought blind. In others, they surrendered after running out of ammunition. In some towns, they were swept up in crowds of refugees fleeing the war zone. The morning of December 16 wasn't a battle. It was a strategic shock, a brutal reminder that war doesn't end just because you believe it's about to. And that shock rippled all the way up to the highest headquarters. Urgent reports from the front overwhelmed the Allied command, leaving it nearly paralyzed in the early hours. No one knew exactly what was happening. No one knew how many troops Hitler had committed to the Ardennes. No one knew whether this was a single thrust or the beginning of a full-scale campaign. Amid the chaos, an emergency meeting was called in Verdun, a city forever tied to the most painful memories of War I. A place once symbolic of endurance, now the setting for decisions that would shape the fate of the entire Western Front. And in that room, filled with anxious generals, where talk turned to retreat, to the danger of being cut off, to how many days a counterattack might take, there was only one man who stood silently, waiting for his moment. Verdun, a name etched into the memory of World War I as a symbol of exhaustion and endurance, once again became the place where history held its breath before exploding. In the winter of 1944, this frozen city still bore the scars of its past. Darkened buildings, icy stone walls, streets cloaked in gray mist. And it was here, in what had once been the very hell of war, that the Allied High Command convened an emergency meeting just hours after the storm in the Ardennes began. Jeeps and command convoys raced in from every corner of the front. Generals, officers, staff, all wore faces heavy with worry. Reports from the front were unclear, constantly interrupted, and each updated map showed the situation deteriorating further. They entered the war room like men walking into a storm without knowing where the eye was. The air in Verdun was so heavy it felt like even breathing took effort. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, was the first to break the silence. He stared up at the map on the wall, where red arrows representing German forces now plunged deep into the American lines. In less than 24 hours, what had seemed like a solid wall of defense had been punctured in multiple places. Towns captured, U.S. units pushed back by dozens of kilometers, supply lines shattered, chaos spreading like wildfire. The generals began to argue, voices tense, overlapping, occasionally flaring into frustration. Bradley, who commanded the Central Front, shook his head as he studied the map. He'd lost multiple units in mere hours. "We need at least 6 to 8 days to mount a counterattack," Bradley said, his voice heavy. "Many of my divisions aren't ready. We can't pivot this fast." Other commanders weren't faring much better. Bad news poured in from Bastogne, from St. Vith, from the northern sectors. They spoke of broken lines, of the threat of German forces reaching the Meuse River, of the terrifying prospect that the Allied front could be split in two. A disaster that could rival anything since Normandy. Some generals even considered pulling forces from more secure areas to reestablish a defensive line. They all knew what Hitler was trying to recreate, the miracle of the Ardennes in 1940, when the Wehrmacht sliced through French lines and shattered the entire defensive structure in just weeks. If the same scenario played out against the Americans, it wouldn't just plunge Europe into chaos, it could drag the war on for years. Verdun fell silent. Everyone in the room understood how dire the situation was. Out in the freezing chaos of the battlefield, soldiers were fighting in confusion, in the cold, in desperation. And here in this room, their fate weighed heavily on every man present. Then Eisenhower turned to the man he often called the Sword of the Allies, General George S. Patton. Patton had barely spoken during the meeting. He stood beside the map, eyes sharp, silently following the German thrusts and scribbling in the leather-bound notebook he always carried. No fear, no panic, no debating, just silence, just watching. Eisenhower asked, "George, how long would it take you to pivot the entire Third Army north and strike the German flank?" The entire room held its breath. Everyone knew this request was nearly impossible. Patton's Third Army was already facing east, preparing for its own campaign. Roads were frozen, logistics weren't in place, and the army was positioned in exactly the opposite direction of new strategic need. Pivoting would mean a 90-degree turn, almost unthinkable in the middle of winter, in the middle of chaos. Everyone expected Patton to ask for at least 3 or 4 days, maybe even a week. But his answer left the room in stunned silence, 48 hours. No one spoke. A few generals turned to each other, incredulous. Bradley furrowed his brow, thinking Patton must be joking. Someone muttered, "Impossible." Verdun was already freezing, but at that moment the temperature seemed to drop even further. Eisenhower stared at Patton. "George, are you serious?" Patton nodded, dead serious. Then he opened his notebook and laid out 3 full operational plans he had prepared, weeks earlier. While others had believed the Ardennes was safe, Patton had sensed something was off in the scattered frontline reports. He had quietly ordered his staff to draft rapid response scenarios. 1 to the north, 1 to the northeast, and 1 to the northwest, all anticipating the possibility of a German strike into the Ardennes or another vulnerable sector. He said, "I knew this could happen, and I prepared for it." Eisenhower exhaled, not out of relief, but because he knew that in that moment, Patton had just handed the Allies their only real shot at survival. Not a guarantee of victory, but their one and only chance. The mood in the room shifted, from shock to something else, hope. Fragile, faint, but real. And that was the moment history turned. Because that decision didn't just pave the way for the rescue of Bastogne, it halted the German advance before it could break the front wide open. But there's an even bigger question. How could Patton give that 48 hours answer, a reply that changed the entire course of World War II, while others needed a week? The answer wasn't found in Verdun. It lay in the weeks before, in the way Patton thought, in the way he saw war not just with his eyes, but through instinct and relentless preparation. Some generals win with firepower, with numbers, with superior equipment. But there are also generals who win because they see what no one else can. Patton belonged to the second kind. His answer, 48 hours in Verdun, wasn't recklessness. It wasn't a burst of improvisation. It wasn't the arrogance of a hot-headed commander. It was a result of weeks of preparation, of a warrior's intuition sharpened over decades, of a man who could read the battlefield like an open book. Weeks before Germany's counteroffensive, Patton sensed something was wrong. Scattered frontline reports, seemingly insignificant, stuck in his mind. Small details. Germany quietly pulling artillery from some fronts, limiting tank usage, cutting back on reconnaissance flights. To most, these were random anomalies. To Patton, they were puzzle pieces, and the pattern they formed didn't feel right. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make him ask questions. No one believed Germany still had the strength to launch a major offensive, but that's exactly why Patton saw the silence as dangerous. He once said, "If the enemy is too quiet, that's not peace. That's the sign of something coming." And so he did what no one else considered. He prepared for the attack everyone thought impossible. At Third Army headquarters, he summoned his staff and issued an order that left his officers stunned. He demanded 3 fully developed operational plans to pivot the entire army in 3 different directions, depending on where the front might break. North, northeast, or northwest. "We have to be ready," he told them. "If the enemy hits any weak point, we must move immediately. Not in 3 days, not in a week. Immediately." One staff officer later recalled, "I didn't understand why Patton believed the Germans could counterattack, but he asked us to plan every mile of road, every bridge, every fuel depot." They didn't just draw maps, they calculated travel time through deep snow, doubled fuel estimates, assigned every regiment its role, considered alternate routes in case of shelling. They rehearsed it all on paper so that with a single order, the plan could spring to life. Patton didn't tolerate complacency. He believed war only rewarded those who knew the enemy was never truly defeated until he was completely broken. And Hitler, mad as he was, still knew how to strike where the Allies least expected it. That instinct is what drove Patton to prepare while others slept. Beyond strategy, there was a core philosophy Patton lived by. Victory doesn't come from reaction. Victory comes from being ready to react. He didn't wait for the battlefield to tell him what to do. He had his answer ready before the question arrived. In internal meetings, Patton didn't hesitate to push his staff to the limit. Many officers complained the planning was excessive, but he remained firm. "I want all 3 plans finished before Christmas," he said, well before the Ardennes offensive began, and they finished them, right on time, though no one quite knew why he was so insistent. Those plans, dismissed as excessive, unnecessary, unrealistic, would become the salvation of the entire Western Front in that historic moment at Verdun. When Eisenhower asked, "How long?" Patton didn't need to think. He had known the answer for days. And that, at its core, is what separates great victories from the rest, being ready before others even start to worry. Where most generals saw war as a series of unfolding events, Patton saw it as a 2-layer chessboard, the layer now and the layer that's coming. While others played the present, he had already stepped into the next move. But even the best preparation, no matter how detailed, still lived only on paper. From 48 hours to actual battlefield action was still a monumental task, because to turn those 3 plans into real movement, the Third Army had to pivot nearly 90 degrees in the coldest winter Europe had seen, under the pressure of a massive German offensive, with frozen roads, no daylight, and time suffocating every second of delay. The answer, 48 hours, was only the beginning. What made it legendary was how Patton made that number real. And that's when we enter one of the most dramatic chapters of this entire story, where tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and a massive logistics train had to turn in the dead of night, racing against snowstorms, against darkness, against the desperation that was tightening its grip on Bastogne by the hour. It was the sleepless night of an entire army. A night not written in ink, but in mud, snow, and sweat. A night when the Third Army pulled off Patton's impossible 90-degree turn. Night fell over eastern France like a thick, dark curtain, so heavy and cold it felt like it could freeze sound itself. In that bitter cold that cut through wool, through coats, through skin, Patton's Third Army began what would become one of the most audacious maneuvers of World War II. A nearly 90-degree pivot, rerouting an entire army in less than 2 days. No one had ever seen anything like it. No one believed it was even possible. But Patton did. And because he believed, tens of thousands of men were forced to believe with him. Paper maps were spread out across tables, held down by cold coffee mugs, steel helmets, ammo boxes, and stones gathered from outside. Staff officers darted back and forth between rooms, carrying stacks of handwritten and hastily typed orders, stamped, sealed, and dispatched into the night. Telephones rang non-stop. Radios crackled and popped with interference. It was as if a massive machine had roared to life, spinning at full speed under the crushing weight of time, and at its center stood Patton, never taking his eyes off the map. He summoned each division commander into the room, speaking fast and sharply, issuing clear, blunt orders. "You've got 3 hours. Your unit moves before it moves." There was no time for debate, no room to explain why something couldn't be done. No one was allowed to say, "We can't." Because on the map, every passing hour meant Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was barely hanging on, moved closer to collapse. Patton strode through the operations rooms, his boots stamping mud onto the floor, leaving long streaks that underlined the urgency of the moment. He scanned every order, corrected wording, slammed his hand on the table when something wasn't right. He knew one small mistake, a wrong road, a forgotten bridge, a miscalculated supply line, could cost hundreds of lives and unravel the entire plan. Outside, the army began to move. One by one, Sherman tanks roared to life with low, guttural growls, their exhausts spewing white smoke that blended into the night fog like ghostly columns. Infantry climbed into trucks, weapons clinking in the cold. Self-propelled artillery rolled out, tires screeching on frozen pavement. Medics, engineers, MPs, everyone was in motion. If you looked from above, you would have seen hundreds of narrow roads glowing faintly. Headlights piercing the fog, forming streams of light shifting course like veins, rerouting the flow of blood through a giant body. But this wasn't a routine march. The roads were frozen over. Snow reached up to soldiers' knees in places, vehicles jammed on hills. Heavy Shermans skidded, collided, and had to be pulled free with chains or towed by recovery crews. In some stretches, the entire column had to halt as engineers cleared trees, smashed ice, or built makeshift bridges. Platoons got lost in the woods, vanishing from radio contact for hours. Convoys were forced to reroute by dozens of kilometers because bridges had been blown by the Germans. In the chaos, some soldiers, exhausted to the point of collapse, fell asleep on the back of trucks and rolled off into the snow without anyone noticing at first. That night, many soldiers described feeling like they were marching into a void, a place where time no longer existed, only footsteps, engine noise, and the suffocating urgency in every breath. Patton wasn't sitting in some warm command post. He climbed into his Jeep, the one with the familiar red flag fluttering from its front bumper, the flag that officers jokingly called the artillery magnet. In the blizzard, in the pitch-black night, he moved from unit to unit. Any soldier who saw the beam of headlights approaching knew the boss was coming. And every time Patton's Jeep stopped, he would shout, "You're going to save Bastogne. You're going to make history. Now move. Fast." It wasn't encouragement. It was an order. In the memoirs of Third Army soldiers, one theme always returns. They had never seen anyone drive them harder. Patton didn't sit back and command from afar. He showed up at the worst choke points, as climbed atop a Sherman's turret to direct traffic as German shells exploded not far off. He stood in the middle of the road, waving his baton, yelling, pushing, igniting fire in every man who passed him. There's a famous story. When a column of tanks got stuck on a narrow road because the lead vehicle had broken down, Patton leapt from his Jeep, rushed to the disabled tank, climbed aboard, and with 3 soldiers, pushed it off into a ditch to clear the path. Then he simply said, "We don't have time. We don't have time." That was the phrase that defined that entire night. Time was slipping away from Bastogne faster than tanks could drive. With every passing hour, the German noose tightened. With every day, the 101st ran lower on bullets, on medicine, on hope. Patton knew this more clearly than anyone. In those hours, his soldiers, though cold, though hungry, though exhausted, kept marching, kept driving, kept fighting through winter itself. Because they knew the truth Patton had burned into them. Nobody else is coming. It's just us. That night, as the hands of the clock ticked forward with cruel indifference, the Third Army gradually did what most high-ranking officers believed was impossible. They turned. They pivoted. A massive army had changed its course in the worst conditions imaginable, and when dawn finally broke on the horizon, dim, freezing, and pale, the last of the troops realized they had just done something history would one day call one of the boldest, most extraordinary feats of World War II. But that was still just the prelude. They had pivoted. Now they had to race. The march was no longer a mission. It was a sprint against time, against snow, against cold, and against death, inching closer to the Bastogne with every minute. From a sleepless night into a frozen day, the Third Army's journey became a war hymn on white roads, a race in which every hour could decide the fate of thousands. On the frozen roads stretching hundreds of kilometers across eastern France, the roar of engines mingled with the howling wind tearing through leafless trees, composing a strange symphony of war. Patton's Third Army, after pulling off the impossible pivot, now entered an even more brutal phase, a breathless race against time to rescue Bastogne. At this point, the soldiers no longer looked at their watches to see how long they'd been moving. They looked at the gray sky to see how much daylight remained in these short winter days. Every passing minute was as costly as blood. The lead elements of the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry, the 80th Infantry, and the 35th Infantry began pushing into the most grueling sections of the route. Snow fell so heavily that trucks had to stop while engineers scraped off enough for the wheels to keep turning. In some places, soldiers had to march ahead and trample down the snow with their boots to open a path for the vehicles. Bridges had to be reinforced in the middle of the night, planks laid, steel cables fastened, just so 30-ton Shermans could make it across. At narrow mountain turns, where roads iced over and twisted like serpents, the light M5 tanks at the front had to crawl forward so slowly that marching infantry could reach out and touch their rear armor. But a single misstep could bottleneck the entire column, setting the advance back by hours. Military police stood in the blizzard, blowing whistles, waving flashlights, shouting, directing the avalanche of steel heading north. On steep slopes, tanks couldn't climb under their own power, wheels spinning helplessly in the slush. "Chains! Chains!" echoed through the woods as engineers, barehanded in freezing wind, smashed ice and laid steel traction mats down on the road. Many would later recall their hands went completely numb, but they worked anyway, because they knew that even the slightest delay might mean Bastogne would fall. Temperatures dropped so low that oil in engines began to freeze. Tank crews had to stop every few hours, lighting small fires under their vehicles to warm the engines and keep the oil thin enough to run. Crews rotated shifts. Some slept while others watched the flames. These were nights no one would forget. Golden firelight flickering on weary faces, stove smoke blending with icy breath to form strange halos of mist across white fields. In the stillness, the tanks stood like steel beasts, silent, gathering strength. At key crossroads, troops stood watch for hours, directing the tangled mass of convoys approaching from dozens of directions. They shouted themselves hoarse to be heard over the wind and the engines. Some collapsed from cold lag, only to be pulled into makeshift roadside shelters by comrades, and returned to post as soon as they regained consciousness. No one wanted to be the reason an entire column was held up. Foot soldiers, faces whipped raw by wind as sharp as blades, hunched forward and pushed on. They couldn't stop for long. Stopping meant cold would clamp into their bones and steal their strength. Many remembered, "We marched without knowing we were marching. We only knew that if we stopped, Bastogne would die." In those endless, bitter hours, across a sea of freezing white, the Third Army radiated a strange, quiet power. Not from rallying speeches, not from visions of victory, but from pure, stubborn perseverance, born from the belief that history had placed this mission in their hands, that they were Bastogne's final shield, that the lives of thousands depended on every step, every tire rotation. Patton appeared at multiple points along the road, sometimes at intersections, sometimes standing on a Sherman's turret. He watched the endless line of vehicles, sometimes shouting encouragement, sometimes offering only a single nod. But that nod, as many veterans later said, was enough to keep them going when their bodies were ready to collapse. News from Bastogne grew bleaker by the hour. Radio signals were intermittent. Reports came in of artillery running dangerously low, medicine completely gone, wounded soldiers lying in the open because the field hospitals had been destroyed. Some paratroopers had nothing but hard biscuits to eat. It was so cold that rifles couldn't fire. Their lubricants had frozen. The Germans kept tightening the ring. With each passing day, Bastogne was like a leaf caught in the center of a storm, trembling, tilted, waiting for either rescue or death. Those reports transformed the Third Army's mission into something more than a military operation. It became a vow they whispered to each other, "We're coming, no matter what it takes." And so, in that bone-piercing cold beneath a sky drowned in snow, their race became a silent war hymn. The tangled sounds of wind, of engines, of shouted orders, of boots crunching over snow, all blended into a strange melody, a melody that spoke of unshakable will. This was no longer a march. It was an army setting fire to the last flicker of hope for the Western Front. But while Patton's Third Army hurled itself north through the blizzard, not far ahead, deep inside the German encirclement, the American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division and the 10th Armored Brigade were holding on in what would become the most desperate hours they had faced since the war began. Bastogne, a small, unremarkable town nestled among the wooded hills of the Ardennes, suddenly became the focal point of the entire Western Front. Not because of its size, its wealth, or any symbolic meaning. Bastogne mattered for one simple, critical reason. It was the largest road junction in the entire region. 7 vital roads converged in this town, and if the Germans took it, they could sever the Allied front, open a path to the Meuse River, and beyond that, to Antwerp. In other words, Bastogne was the key to Hitler's desperate gamble. That's why the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, one of America's elite forces, along with the 10th Armored Brigade, were ordered to move in and hold the town. But by the time they arrived, the noose had already tightened. Snow fell relentlessly. The sky was locked under thick clouds, grounding all supply flights. Ammunition, fuel, and medicine were cut off within the first few days. From the moment the encirclement closed, Bastogne became a lonely fortress. The paratroopers, trained for speed, aggression, and mobility, suddenly found themselves forced to defend, in conditions as brutal as any in the war. Fighting holes were buried under snow. Uniforms offered little warmth, boots cracked from frost. Many were so frozen they couldn't move their fingers. They used whatever they could find, canvas, parachute fabric, burlap sacks, to shield themselves from the cutting wind. And on the hills surrounding Bastogne, German self-propelled artillery, tanks, and infantry began closing in. Every day, shells rained down on the town. Every day brought casualties. The field hospital, set up inside a church, became the most heartbreaking sight of all. Wounded men lying in rows, moaning in pain, their cries blending with whispered prayers. In those conditions, morale became Bastogne's strongest weapon. On December 22, 1944, with fog blanketing the hills and artillery thundering without pause, the Germans delivered an ultimatum: unconditional surrender. A German officer, calm and polite, presented the terms, warning that if the Americans didn't comply, the town would be obliterated. The battlefield held its breath. The Germans expected an honorable surrender. American officers waited to see how their acting commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, would respond. His reply was a single word: nuts. A short, sharp word, hard to translate, but full of contempt. Roughly meaning, not a chance, or you must be joking. The Germans didn't understand. They needed a translator to explain. When they finally grasped the meaning, they stood in stunned silence. Bastogne had just sent a clear message. They would not surrender, even if it meant dying to the last man. But spirit, no matter how unbreakable, can't replace ammunition. The situation inside Bastogne quickly became dire. Artillery shells ran dangerously low. Soldiers shared rifle rounds one by one. Wounded men lay without morphine, their agony drawn out in silence. Rations dwindled. Some units resorted to eating snow to stave off hunger. It was so cold, breath froze into ice within seconds. A paratrooper's journal recorded, "We weren't thinking about victory, we were just wondering if we'd still be alive by nightfall." And yet what kept Bastogne standing was the extraordinary cooperation of people who had nothing left to give. Squads rebuilt trenches every time German shells churned them into craters. Medics sprinted down shattered streets to drag the living back to cover. Local civilians, terrified but resilient, opened their cellars to shelter soldiers, sharing the last of their water, their bread. Day by day, Bastogne became more than a town. It became a symbol of defiance, of resilience, of the refusal to bow. A symbol so powerful that even the Germans had to respect it. But even symbols have limits. Bastogne couldn't hold out forever. Each hour, the noose tightened, defensive positions were lost. American officers began preparing to pull back and defend only the town center. Even the most optimistic among them knew they were 24 to 48 hours away from disaster. Bastogne needed rescue, and they needed it now. Each morning and evening, the soldiers inside the pocket looked south, toward where they knew Patton's Third Army was on the move. They didn't know how much longer they could hold, but they knew one thing. If relief didn't come, they would die here. There are moments in war when men no longer fight to win, only to survive a few hours more. Bastogne was living those hours. In the breathless black nights under the whine of shells and the moan of wind, they clung to each other for warmth and asked the same question, again and again. Where are they now? Are they close? It wasn't a strategist's question. It was the question of men standing at the edge of extinction. And then, on Christmas Eve, as snow still fell, as shells still roared, as Bastogne trembled inside the tightening ring, something changed. Out there, just a few dozen kilometers away, the spearhead of the Third Army finally spotted the enemy's firelight flickering ahead. The moment of contact between one army racing against fate and another holding the line in utter desperation was near. And that brings us to the next chapter. A White Christmas. Not painted in snow, but in blood. Where the meeting of Patton's Third Army and the defenders of Bastogne would become one of the most emotional, unforgettable moments of the entire Second World War. Christmas 1944. Elsewhere in the world, people lit warm candles, hung red stockings, and unwrapped small gifts beside glowing fireplaces. But in the Ardennes, that white Christmas carried no color of pure snow. It came in the color of blood, of smoke, of icy winds slicing through flesh like frozen blades. In Bastogne, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were clinging to the edge of despair. And to the south, Patton's Third Army was locked in a desperate sprint against time in the final, critical hours. On Christmas Eve, the night was pitch black, the snow so heavy it seemed intent on erasing every trace of humanity. The lead American armored units had to drive with their lights dimmed low, just enough to see the slush in front of their tracks. Engines growled in the cold, choked and strained. The gunners shivered, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion after days without sleep. But no one stopped, no one complained, because they all knew, just a few dozen kilometers ahead, fellow soldiers were waiting, like drowning men waiting for the final life raft. By the morning of December 24th, the air in Bastogne was suffocating. German artillery pounded key points relentlessly, slicing the defensive perimeter into fragments. On Christmas Eve, the town looked like a ghost. Every surviving building trembled with each blast. In the underground shelters, like wounded soldiers huddled under blankets, their breath turning to mist. None of them knew if they would live to see the morning. At the same time, on the road north, the tanks of Combat Command R, the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division, were crawling across frozen fields near Eisenhower. The wind lashed at soldiers' faces, forcing many to wrap scarves around their heads, leaving only their eyes exposed. This was the most grueling phase of the advance. They had to punch through German positions holding the line and carve a path into Bastogne in the narrow sliver of daylight left. Gunfights broke out every few minutes. Shermans blasted at plumes of smoke hiding enemy positions. Infantry charged forward, slipped on the ice, got back up and kept going. Many would later describe the moment as running through a dark dream, where everything moved in slow motion, yet death arrived too fast. By the time they reached Eisenhower, the sky was already fading into late afternoon. Only a few hours of light remained. They had to commit everything to breaking the final German roadblocks. And then, after hours of brutal fighting through fire and snow and howling wind, someone saw something that made their hearts stop. Silhouettes wearing the familiar helmets of the 101st Airborne, standing on the skyline behind scorched walls. At first, the tankers thought it was a mirage, but then one paratrooper waved and another shouted, "It's the tanks! They're here!" And the entire Bastogne line erupted with emotion. The paratroopers, stiff, exhausted, filthy with mud and blood, ran from their defensive posts. Many couldn't even shout, but they still raised their arms, still waved, still smiled despite lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. Some collapsed the moment they touched a Sherman, not from injury, but from relief and exhaustion. Tankers jumped down, grabbed their hands, hugged them like long-lost brothers. One soldier from the 4th Armored later said, "I've never seen men so overjoyed just to lay eyes on a tank." Many of the airborne troops could only get out one sentence: "You made it. You really made it." There was no Christmas feast, no music, no gifts. But that moment, when the two armies met, one breaking in from the blizzard, the other crawling out from the siege, was the greatest Christmas gift they would ever receive. And what made it even more remarkable, Patton had broken through to Bastogne a full day ahead of schedule, a feat that led Eisenhower himself to admit that no one else could have pulled it off. But though the ring around Bastogne was broken, the war was far from over. Bastogne was only the beginning of the American counteroffensive. The Germans were still throwing everything they had into the fight, clinging to the hope of one last reversal. still fighting with the desperation of men betting on a final impossible chance. Inside Germany, its war machine was breathing its final gasps. Fuel shortages, food scarcity, manpower exhaustion, all of it was eating away at Hitler's crumbling empire. German commanders, in despair, wrote bitter lines in their diaries, and as the Allies regained control of the skies, the brutal truth could no longer be ignored. That brings us to the next chapter, when the nightmare of the Ardennes was no longer an explosion from outside, but the slow implosion from within Nazi Germany itself. After the rescue of Bastogne, a wave of relief swept through Allied lines. But while the heart of the Ardennes had held firm, the war was far from over. Bastogne was a turning point, not a conclusion. Hitler's offensive still had strength, and despite heavy losses, German divisions continued pushing deeper into Allied lines, desperately hoping to regain the initiative. But from that moment on, the true threat to Germany no longer came from outside. It came from within its own crumbling war machine. First came the fuel crisis. The entire Ardennes offensive had been built on the gamble that Germany could seize Allied fuel depots. But Bastogne held, other supply routes remained intact, and that meant hundreds of German tanks, Panther and Tiger behemoths once feared across the battlefield, were reduced to motionless hulks stranded on the roadside, bone dry and useless. Armored crews abandoned their vehicles and retreated on foot, hopeless. A German officer wrote, "We had guns, we had ammunition, but no way to move. This was no longer war. It was a slow death." Second came the collapse of morale. In the early days of the Ardennes push, German soldiers fought with the belief that this was their last chance to turn the tide. But when Bastogne didn't fall, and the weather began to clear, allowing Allied aircraft back into the skies, that fragile hope was shattered. Waves of heavy bombers rained fire on German supply lines, striking the Wehrmacht exactly where it was weakest. Convoys that had hidden under trees for days were now exposed and destroyed without mercy. One German veteran later said, "We no longer saw our commanders. No more radio, no more orders, only bombs, snow, and fear." Third came chaos in leadership. Hitler no longer trusted his own general staff. He issued orders for every minute detail, forbade retreats, banned unit redeployments, refused to alter plans, even when reality on the ground had changed completely. These rigid commands trapped German forces in a deadly vice, unable to advance, unable to retreat. In C's diaries, many German generals described Hitler as a man playing chess with pieces that no longer exist. He couldn't see the brutal truth his soldiers faced each day. They were out of strength, out of ammo, and out of hope. Fourth came the weather. As the blizzard cleared, the skies over the Ardennes turned into that signature crisp blue of the European winter, and instantly, Allied air power came roaring back. Thunderbolts, Mustangs, Typhoons, all dove-like blades from the heavens. German convoys, once safe under snow and forest, became ideal targets. Entire units were obliterated in a single afternoon under relentless bombardment. With no Luftwaffe left to protect them, the Germans, once the hunters, became the hunted. And finally, the greatest factor in Germany's downfall was time. Hitler had staked everything on a blitzkrieg. If he didn't win in the opening days, the German war machine would collapse under its own weight. And that's exactly what happened. After the failure at Bastogne, the Wehrmacht didn't just lose a battle, it lost the war because it had nothing left to recover with. As Patton pushed his forces further north, striking the flanks of the German advance, what he saw wasn't the army that once terrified all of Europe. He saw scattered, hollowed-out units, low on morale. He saw bridges hastily destroyed, trucks abandoned, piles of artillery shells with no way to transport them. He saw a war machine crushed by its own momentum. An American officer described the scene. "We weren't fighting an army anymore, we were walking through a ghost." The Ardennes counteroffensive, once Germany's final hope, had become the largest crack in its entire military foundation. From that point forward, the question was no longer, will Germany lose, but when will they lose? And in the midst of that realization, Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, began reviewing every moment from the day the Ardennes storm began. He studied maps, read reports, re-examined the decisions of each commander, and the more he looked, the more one name stood out. The man who changed the course of the war with a single, impossible action. The man who answered 48 hours while the front was collapsing around him. And that brings us to the next chapter, when Eisenhower said what history would later confirm: if there's anyone on Earth who can do the impossible, it's Patton. As the Ardennes storm gradually broke under the weight of the Allied counteroffensive, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower spent long hours inside his command room, studying every map, every report, every move that had played out during those breathless weeks. The red ink that once showed the deep German thrust, the infamous Bulge, was now shrinking. The overall picture had returned to Allied control. But what weighed on Eisenhower wasn't the victory itself. It was how that victory had been won. It wasn't achieved by the strongest weapons or by overwhelming numbers. It came from the bold, decisive act of a single man. Eisenhower told his closest officers that there were two pivotal moments in the entire Battle of the Ardennes. First, that Bastogne didn't fall, and second, that Patton's Third Army turned and reached the town just in time. And the second, in his view, was even more strategically significant. Because without Patton, Bastogne would have been lost. And if Bastogne fell, the entire Western Front could have been split, triggering a cascade of disasters beyond imagination. In his own notes, Eisenhower wrote, "When I asked Patton how long it would take him to counterattack, I expected 4 or 5 days. I was ready to accept a week. But Patton said, 48 hours. I'd never seen anything like it. No one else would have dared say that number, except him." What struck Eisenhower wasn't just the speed, but the certainty of the answer. No hesitation, no calculation. Patton spoke as if he already knew the question was coming, and in fact, that was his defining trait. Patton didn't just prepare for what others could see, he prepared for what no one believed was even possible. Eisenhower later recalled that moment in Verdun when Patton opened his leather-bound notebook and calmly laid out 3 full counterattack plans he'd already written. The room fell into stunned silence. Seasoned generals, men who commanded tens of thousands, were floored by how far ahead Patton had been thinking. "That wasn't luck," Eisenhower said. "That was deliberate preparation. The discipline of a mind that saw war not as it was, but as it could become." After the campaign, standing before his top commanders, Eisenhower made it official. "If there is anyone on this earth who ever accomplished the impossible, it is George S. Patton." He didn't say it to flatter Patton. He said it to acknowledge a fact that in the most desperate moment of the war, amid blizzards, chaos, despair, and intelligence failures, only one man had held on to clarity, and the belief that there was still a chance if someone acted immediately. Years later, when reflecting on the Ardennes, Eisenhower still referred to Patton as the man who created the turning point. He said, "Anyone can lead when things are going well, but only the extraordinary can lead when everything is falling apart." And that is the essence of Patton. He wasn't the most technically perfect general. He wasn't the calmest. He wasn't the most beloved. But he had one rare quality: the ability to reshape the battlefield through bold action and silent preparation. And that brings us to a lesson far more important than the victory at Ardennes, a lesson Eisenhower and military strategists to this day still return to. Wars aren't won just with guns and bullets. They're won with the art of preparation, an art that Patton mastered, and one whose full value only becomes clear when you step back and see the entire picture of the Battle of the Bulge. And so, from Eisenhower's admiration, the story naturally leads us to the next chapter, where what Patton achieved will be remembered not just as a battlefield triumph, but as a strategic masterclass, a lesson in foresight, in contingency, and in the readiness for the unthinkable. In war, people often glorify the heroic moments on the battlefield, the roar of gunfire, the rapid advances, the head-on clashes. But the Battle of the Bulge, and especially Patton's role in it, left behind a lesson that runs counter to that instinct. Sometimes, victory doesn't come from the moment the first shot is fired, but from the silent days that came before it. Not from reacting in the storm, but from preparing before the storm ever arrived. When we look at the Ardennes campaign through the lens of time, we realize that what decided the outcome wasn't just the Allied numerical advantage or the dramatic counteroffensive that broke the siege of Bastogne. What decided the outcome was the fact that one man had prepared for something that everyone else believed was impossible. Patton didn't foresee the future with luck or magic. He prepared for it with iron discipline, razor-sharp, instinct, and an unshakable belief in the chaos at the heart of war. Lesson 1. Preparation is not a backup plan, it is the strategy. While other commanders read the same frontline reports and felt reassured that the Ardennes were quiet, Patton read those very same documents and saw terrifying gaps. The enemy's silence didn't soothe him, it alerted him. He understood that war doesn't move according to human predictions. It moves according to the rules of chaos. And in chaos, a commander must always stay a step ahead, sometimes two. When Patton ordered his staff to draw up 3 separate maneuver plans, each for a different scenario, he was seen as overly cautious, even paranoid. But those 3 plans, written in quiet before any attack began, became the shield that saved an entire front when the Ardennes exploded into fire. It wasn't luck, it was the result of treating preparation as the soul of strategy. Lesson 2. Preparation is the ability to see what others overlook. In war, information is never perfect. Intelligence is never complete. No one sees the full picture. But a great commander doesn't wait for certainty. He reads the signs and fragments. A German unit suddenly going quiet, a supply route that's oddly inactive, a seemingly minor scout report. Patton picked up on these, not because he had more data, but because he knew how to connect the dots into something bigger. Lesson 3. Preparation means building a force agile enough to respond to the unexpected. Patton's Third Army wasn't the most powerful force, but it was the most flexible. They were trained to move fast, reorganize fast, pivot fast. When the 90-degree turn order came down, no one debated it. They moved. Why? Because Patton had already prepared them for that moment. He had instilled in them the belief that speed is strength and readiness is salvation. And the final and greatest lesson of the Bulge. Preparation is the only thing that can turn the impossible into the possible. Without preparation, Patton would have been just another impulsive general. But because of preparation, he became the only one who could flip the board when everything else was collapsing. Without preparation, the Third Army would have been just another military unit. But because of preparation, they became the only army capable of racing through ice and time to save Bastogne. Without preparation, 48 hours would have been an empty boast, but because of preparation, it became one of the most decisive moments in military history. When historians look back at the Bulge, they can debate tactics, strategies, or intelligence failures. But one truth stands beyond dispute. Patton's preparation saved the front. And that's why this story isn't just about war, it's a lesson for every part of life. Sometimes, what determines your fate isn't what you do in the moment of crisis. It's what you quietly, methodically, relentlessly prepared before the crisis ever arrived. A lesson that illuminates everything Patton stood for. And from there, the story leads us into the final chapter, where the moment of 48 hours is no longer just a decision, but a lightning strike that split open the storm. There are moments in history that aren't written in gunfire, nor marked by milestones on a map, but shaped by a single answer, just one. And Patton's 48 hours at Verdun was one such moment. It wasn't shouted over a battlefield, nor drowned out by the roar of artillery. It was spoken in a cold room among tense faces at a time when everything seemed to be falling apart. Yet one answer turned the tide of World War II. Only in hindsight do we grasp the full weight of those 2 seemingly simple words. It wasn't recklessness, it was the result of weeks of preparation. It wasn't an empty promise, it was unshakable faith in the strength of his own troops. It wasn't the rashness of a famously aggressive general, it was the calm resolve of a man who saw what others were still overlooking. Patton proved that history isn't shaped only by grand battles, but also by quiet decisions. Had he said 4 days, had he hesitated, had he asked for more time to prepare, Bastogne would have been lost. And if Bastogne had fallen, the door to Europe could have swung wide open for the Germans. Everything that followed, from the collapse of the Ardennes offensive to the downfall of Nazi Germany, began at that very moment. But what makes this story truly powerful isn't just the victory. It's the reminder that in every situation, sometimes history, or even our own fate, is decided in the very moments when others are still frozen in doubt. True power doesn't lie in how fast you react, but in being so well prepared that you don't need to. Patton didn't wait for the battlefield to tell him what to do. He was ready before the battlefield spoke. when we remember Ardennes, Bastogne, and the soldiers who marched through blizzards to rescue their comrades under siege, what lingers isn't just the brutality of war, but the greatness of humanity, the ability to stand firm, to decide, and to do the impossible. In today's world, all of us will face moments like that. Moments no one can foresee, choices that define everything, answers that might change the course of our lives. And Patton's lesson still holds true. Prepare while others are still asleep. See further while others only see what's near. Believe in yourself when the world doubts you. And above all, remember, sometimes destiny isn't decided in the moment we act, but in the moment we choose that we will act. Thank you for joining us in revisiting one of the most heroic and profound chapters of World War II. If this story moved you, leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to History War to keep hearing history told with all the depth, emotion, and respect it deserves. See you in the next video.